what's the best way to fix a low blood sugar? Or to start, what is a low blood sugar exactly? A low blood sugar, as defined by most people, would be anything below 70 milligrams per deciliter. Now, you might have heard that you need to correct when it's below 80 or below 100, but that seems to come from a fear from doctors who have patients that are out of control and are at risk even if they're above a normal blood sugar. If you're following the recommendations of Dr. Bernstein, you're not going to have this issue. And plus, the average healthy person's blood sugar usually is around 80 to 90 unless they've just eaten. So that's where you want to keep it at, and you don't want to correct what would otherwise be a normal blood sugar, obviously, because the whole point is to have normal blood sugars. So you want to correct when it's below 70. That's what I always do. Now, context is important here. If you're about to go to bed and you have insulin on board, or you're sick, or you haven't figured out your basal rate, that's going to make an impact, that context, on how cautious you should be. So act accordingly, think with your noggin, keep all that in mind. But in most cases, 70 milligrams per deciliter is your point where you want to start correcting. Now, how do we correct a low blood sugar? Doctors will often recommend that you need to take 15 grams of some carbohydrate food in order to correct a low blood sugar, whether it be juice or cookies or snacks or whatever it is. And I find this irresponsible, to say the least. For one thing, you shouldn't need the same amount of sugar to correct a 65 that you would need for a 35, right? Because you don't want to correct too much and end up way too high, and then you need to take insulin and then risk going back too low again. What you want is to correct just enough to bring you into that normal 80 to 90 range. How do we do that? Well, you have to experiment a little bit. What you have to do is see exactly how much glucose you need to get to 80 to 90 from wherever you're at. The best way to do that is whenever you get low, to take a very certain amount of sugar and see what happens. For example, let's say my blood sugar is 60 and I take a single glucose tab. That's 4 grams of sugar. I'm going to do that, and then 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 30 minutes later, see how high my blood sugar gets. If it only goes up 5 to 65, then I know I need to take 2 to get back up to 70. If it goes up to 80 or 90, I know I'm doing pretty good. You want to actually take a very specific amount, write that down, and then write down the result. And do that over time, log all these instances, and that way you know exactly how much 4 grams, 8 grams, so on, raises your blood sugar. Because again, you don't want to take so much that you go too high, but you don't want to take too little that you're still low, obviously. You want to take just enough to where you're at that 80 to 90, and the best way to do that is to experiment, log the results, and see exactly how glucose affects you. Now, once you have that figured out, what's the best kind of food to correct the low blood sugar with? Now, you might be tempted to use a cheat meal like cookies or cupcakes or chips, but the problem with all of that is that it's actually not very predictable. You need something that's predictable. You need something that's going to be consistent, the same exact thing over time. Because remember, you're doing that experiment to see how much glucose impacts you. If you're using different foods every time, that's going to vary based on the other stuff in that food. You need something consistent, you need something precise, and the best thing for that is glucose tabs. Why glucose tabs? Because glucose tabs are specifically meant to be precise. Other foods can be within 20% of whatever their nutrition label says, but glucose tabs are meant to be specific for diabetics. And they're also just sugar. There's nothing else in them. So they're much easier to predict with, and they're also very fast acting. They're easy predictive, they're concise, they're consistent, and that leads to better predictability. That's very important. So be sure to use glucose tabs. And I know glucose tabs can be a little expensive, so another alternative would be Smarties. Another reason to use glucose tabs is because, unlike the cheat foods, they're not nearly as tempting. I mean, let's be honest here, they kind of taste like chalk. Especially the grape ones, ugh. But that's actually a good thing, because you don't want to be correcting low blood sugars with food that you enjoy. I know it might sound counterintuitive, but hear me out. Let's say you have a child with type 1, and you give that child a cookie every time they're low. What's that child going to start wanting to do if once it gets a cookie? Oh, well, I better get low so I can get my cookie. You don't want to create that reward system, and that's going to happen for you as well, even as an adult. You're going to start equating low blood sugars with rewards, and it's going to make a really bad incentive for you. And plus, that's going to be a lot of temptation. Every time you eat cheap food, you might be tempted to fall back into old habits. So avoid the old habits, avoid creating a bad reward system where you're rewarding a low blood sugar by sticking to something that isn't quite too pleasant, like glucose tabs, or maybe Smarties, if you're feeling a little cheap. So keep those things in mind. 1, you want to correct whenever it's below 70 milligrams per deciliter most of the time. 2, you want to experiment and find exactly how glucose affects you and use just enough to get back to 80 to 90 without going overboard and without going too low again. And 3, use glucose tabs. They are the most precise thing to use, and they're very effective, very consistent, and lead to much better predictability. That's all I have for now, folks. This is how we tame type 1.